She threw herself in front of a Duke's war horse to save a child. And in that single reckless heartbeat, she shattered the invisible line that separated people like her from people like him. And from that moment on, the Duke never looked at her the same way again. The day had begun like any other in the outer districts. Dust rising from worn cobblestones, merchants shouting over one another, and servants like Liora moving quickly with their heads lowered, careful not to draw attention, careful not to exist beyond what was required of them. But everything changed the moment the horns sounded from the eastern gate, long and commanding, announcing the arrival of the Duke's procession, a spectacle that sent a ripple through the crowd as nobles straightened. Guards snapped into formation, and commoners pressed themselves back against walls, knowing better than to be seen when power passed by. Liora had been carrying a bundle of feed toward the stables when she heard it. Her first instinct not curiosity, but caution, because nothing good ever came from being too close to nobility, not for someone like her, not for someone who had learned early that survival depended on staying unnoticed. But the streets were already tightening with bodies, and before she could slip away, she found herself caught at the edge of the main road just as the Duke's riders came into view, rows of armored soldiers, banners snapping in the wind, and at the center of it all, the Duke himself atop a massive black war horse, the kind bred not for beauty but for battle, its muscles coiled with restrained violence, its hooves striking the ground with a force that made even the bravest step back. He was exactly as the rumors described, cold, composed, untouchable, his gaze fixed forward as if the world around him were nothing more than scenery, as if the people lining the streets were shadows cast by something more important. But Liora didn't look at him for long, because she had no reason to, because men like him didn't belong in her world, and she certainly didn't belong in theirs. So she lowered her eyes and waited for the procession to pass, counting the seconds until it would be over, until she could return to the quiet safety of being ignored. But then the world broke. It started with a sound, sharp, sudden, rom, a wooden cart tipping somewhere ahead, its wheel snapping against stone, followed by the panicked cry of a merchant losing control of his goods, and then the horse reacted. War horses were trained for chaos, but they were also trained for war, and war meant aggression, meant movement, meant overpowering whatever stood in their path. And when the Duke's mount reared, towering above the crowd with a violent jerk of its head, everything dissolved into screaming. People scattered in every direction, bodies colliding, hands grabbing blindly for escape, the carefully ordered line of spectators collapsing into chaos as fear took over. But not everyone moved fast enough. Liora saw him before anyone else seemed to, the small boy standing in the center of the road, frozen in place, his wide eyes locked on the towering animal charging toward him, his legs refusing to obey the instinct to run, and for a fraction of a second, everything narrowed, the noise fading, the movement blurring, until there was only that single, terrible certainty. He was going to die. She could have turned away. She could have done what everyone else did, saved herself, vanished into the crowd, pretended she hadn't seen, but something inside her refused, something older than fear, heavier than reason, something that remembered what it felt like to be the one no one came back for. And before she even realized what she was doing, she moved. The world snapped back into motion as she ran, her feet hitting the ground harder than she thought possible, her body cutting through the chaos in a straight line toward the boy, toward the danger everyone else was fleeing. And she didn't think about the consequences, didn't think about who she was, or who the Duke was, or what it would mean to interfere. She only knew that if she didn't reach him in time, there would be nothing left to regret. The horse was already descending when she got there, its hooves slicing through the air with terrifying force, and she didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. She threw herself forward with everything she had, shoving the boy out of the way just as the shadow of the animal swallowed her whole. The impact never came the way she expected it to. Instead, there was a jarring halt, a violent shift of weight as the horse was pulled back at the last possible second, its hooves slamming into the ground mere inches from where she lay, the force of it sending a shock through the earth beneath her, close enough that she felt the wind of it against her skin, close enough that for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Silence followed. Not the quiet of peace, but the kind that falls after something almost irreparable has been narrowly avoided. Thick and suffocating as the entire street froze, every eye turning toward the same point, toward the girl who should not have been there, who should not have done what she had just done. Liora remained where she had fallen, her chest rising and falling too quickly, her hands trembling against the stone as the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. But she didn't look up, didn't dare to, because she could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of attention pressing down on her from a place she had spent her entire life avoiding. Above her, the horse snorted, restless but restrained, and for the first time since the chaos began, the Duke moved. He pulled the reins with controlled precision, calming the animal with a quiet authority that spoke of years spent mastering exactly this kind of moment. But his gaze was no longer fixed ahead, no longer detached from the world around him. It was on her. Liora felt it before she saw it, a presence sharp enough to cut through the lingering noise of the crowd. And when she finally lifted her head, just slightly, just enough to confirm what she already knew, their eyes met. It lasted only a second, maybe less, but something in that moment changed in a way that neither of them could take back. Because he wasn't looking at her the way nobles looked at servants. He wasn't looking through her. He was looking at her, as if trying to understand what she was, how she had done what she had done, why someone so insignificant had just stepped into the path of something that even trained soldiers feared. Around them, the whispers had already begun, low and urgent, spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. But Liora didn't hear them, didn't care about them, because all she could focus on was the fact that she had been seen, truly seen, by someone who had the power to change her life with a single word, and in that moment, she realized something that made her pulse quicken with a different kind of fear. She hadn't just saved a child. She had stepped into the Duke's world, and there was no stepping back from that. From the moment she stepped into the Duke's path, Liora stopped being invisible, and in a world ruled by power, that alone was enough to change everything. The chaos in the streets slowly settled, but the tension didn't fade. Whispers followed her like a rising tide as guards forced the crowd back into place, and the rescued child was pulled into his mother's arms, her grateful sobs echoing faintly behind Liora as she pushed herself to stand, her body still trembling from how close death had come, her only instinct now to disappear, to return to the quiet safety of being unnoticed. But she didn't get the chance. "You." A calm, commanding voice cut through the noise, and the single word rooted her to the ground because she knew exactly who it belonged to. Slowly, she turned, lowering her gaze at once, her heart pounding harder than it had even moments ago, because facing danger was one thing, but facing the Duke was something else entirely. He sat tall on his horse, composed once more, as if the chaos had never touched him, yet his attention remained fixed on her with a weight that made it impossible to breathe normally. "Come forward," he said, and though his tone was quiet, it carried absolute authority. Liora hesitated only a fraction before obeying, stepping closer with measured caution, every instinct warning her she had already crossed a line she could not uncross. When she stopped before him, she kept her head bowed, waiting, the silence stretching long enough to make the watching crowd restless, until finally he spoke. "Why?" The question caught her off guard, not because she didn't have an answer, but because it sounded like he truly expected one. "It was just a child, Your Grace," she said softly, choosing the simplest truth, hoping it would be enough, hoping it would end this. But it didn't. "Just," he repeated, and there was something in his voice now, something sharper, more curious, and she felt his gaze study her more closely, as if her answer had only deepened the question. Most would have run. Leora's fingers tightened at her sides, and before she could stop herself, the truth slipped out, quieter this time, but far more dangerous. Most people have something to lose. The words hung in the air, heavier than she intended, and the moment they settled, she braced for the consequences, for anger or dismissal, but neither came. Instead, the silence deepened, and when she risked a brief glance upward, she saw the shift in him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. He wasn't looking through her anymore. He was looking at her, as if trying to understand her, as if she no longer fit into the place he expected her to occupy. The realization sent a quiet unease through her chest. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question alone unsettled her more than anything else, because names mattered, and giving hers to someone like him felt like stepping further into something she didn't understand. "Liora," she answered after a pause. He repeated it once, under his breath, as though committing it to memory, and then, without another word, he turned his horse, signaling the procession to move again. Just like that, it was over, or at least, it should have been. The guards resumed their positions, the nobles straightened, and the crowd slowly began to breathe again, but nothing felt the same. Eyes followed her now, filled with curiosity and suspicion instead of indifference, and Liora retreated quickly, slipping back toward the edges of the street where she belonged, her pulse still unsteady. By the time the Duke and his riders disappeared from view, leaving only dust and murmurs behind, she told herself it would fade, that he would forget, that this moment would pass like everything else. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true, because the way he had looked at her was not something easily forgotten. And as the noise of the city returned around her, one thought lingered, heavier than the rest. She hadn't just been seen, she had been remembered. And that, in the Duke's world, was far more dangerous than being invisible. The truth, when it finally reached the Duke, didn't arrive with noise or chaos, but with a quiet weight that unsettled everything he thought he controlled. What began as curiosity turned into something far more dangerous as he uncovered fragments of a past long buried, records erased, a noble house destroyed, and a single missing heir who was never meant to survive. Liora, not a stable girl, not a nobody, but the last living piece of something he had allowed to be erased. When he summoned her, she entered without fear, and that alone told him enough. "You knew," he said, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "I remembered," she replied calmly. The difference hit harder than accusation. She had always known, and still she had saved that child. "Why?" he asked again, quieter this time. Liora held his gaze, unflinching. "Because I know what it feels like when no one comes back for you." The words settled heavily between them, and for the first time, the Duke had no response. No command, no control. She hadn't acted out of loyalty. She hadn't acted out of duty. She had acted despite him, despite everything he represented. "You could have let him die," he said. "Yes," she answered simply. And somehow, that made it worse. When he finally asked what she wanted, expecting anger, revenge, anything, she only shook her head. Nothing. That single word left him more unsettled than any threat ever could. Because someone who wanted nothing, feared nothing. As she turned to leave, the Duke remained still, the weight of his past pressing in for the first time in years. The girl who should have been invisible had become something else entirely, a reminder, a reckoning, and perhaps the one person capable of undoing everything. And in that moment, one truth became clear. He would never look at her the same way again.